So this video here is part 3 in the series of videos that look at Miriam Weiwei Lo's poem, Home, which is set for study for Module A for English Standard. So looking at part 2 of this poem, it's titled Without Warning, and I've put this image here to really highlight that sense of light, that sense of hope that perhaps this second part creates for her in terms of finding her metaphorical sense of home, which really reflects her sense of identity, which she hopes to find a sense of through her understanding of her own culture. So part 2, Without Warning, is an identification of home as the other place, a home that is heaven perhaps. And we've got that through that really heightened sense of light that comes through this poem. So this poem has no reference to her cultural background, but it is a spiritual confession of her beliefs. There are 2 parts within this section, so 2 stanzas which we will go through, and the first half focuses on the present body and death, while the second half is marked with the realization that someone is at work within her, and perhaps that is a greater being that is trying to assist her in finding a sense of identity and a sense of hope in terms of finding that sense of belonging. So looking at the first stanza within part 2, it reads, "An explosion of light, a word that is itself, a word to possess me, an image so bright and complete, it can only be seen with eyes shut tight, as in prayer, as in sleep, a dream that outlives reality, an image to enter me, like a knife, like a nail, hammering in till it finds its reply, taking my body, like breath, like the strong kiss of a bridegroom, like death in all its finality." Now, I think that there's real shift in terms of the part 1 and moving on to part 2. There's some real graphic imagery that's presented within this first stanza, and it's quite harsh in the way that it presents itself within this stanza. So looking at the first part of this stanza, she references light, and that can be an explosion of light, the idea that it is sudden and it is quite vast and quite big, this explosion of light. And that explosion of light can be symbolic of a revelation or perhaps an epiphany that she's had in terms of her quest to find her sense of self and her sense of identity. And she refers to a word. So she says a word that is in itself, a word to possess me. And we can have the idea of word directly relating to the idea of the Bible and the idea of it taking control of her, it's possessing her. And perhaps without that, her reflecting on that, a word within itself, a word to possess me. And she moves on again to highlight that image of light, an image so bright and complete. The idea that perhaps this light that's within her, this word that's within her, or she's drawn to, can be a sense of completion for her. And it can be seen with eyes shut tight. And that's a real juxtaposition that's created there in terms of, in order to see it, we need to have eyes shut tight, and perhaps that is within prayer, as she goes on to mention. We have a series of similes here. So she says, as in prayer, as in sleep. So within this series of similes here, she's trying to allude to us in terms of the way in which she hopes to see this presence of light, this presence of, I guess, metaphorically finding her sense of home, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection to her identity through her culture. We then have some series of images here, and these are the real harsh images that I was mentioning before. So she says, an image to enter me like a knife, like a nail, hammering till it finds its reply, taking my body. So it almost feels as though she's helpless within this accumulation of similes here, as in sleep, like a knife, like a nail. And we've got almost this symbolic visual representation of a crucifixion here in terms of the nails hammering in till it finds its reply and taking her body. And again, we continue on with these similes in terms of like breath, like a strong kiss, like death in all its finality. So it's almost as though this realization, this explosion of light will be so vivid and so harsh, it will be all-consuming, and it is like death, that it is so final. So this blast of light, in terms of her finding this sense of home, or her with this, without warning, she receives this blast of light, which she is, I guess, helpless in terms of being able to stop. Moving on to the second stanza within this poem, it says, "Someone is at work in me, translating this corrupt language of my body, the dark, bitter words of my heart, into the pure language of that other place, where every word is a radiant arrival, and that draws me across the threshold and claims me as its own." So we've got a little bit of hope within this stanza, but we have a real sense of juxtaposition. So if we look at this corrupt language, which has then been juxtaposed with this purity, this pure sense of language, and then we have in terms of where every word is radiant in its arrival. And I think that this juxtaposition here really tries to highlight this internal struggle that she has in terms of finding her sense of identity, where she belongs. Is it the East, in which she knows so much about and she's been grown up in, or is it the West? Can she find within Western culture a sense of belonging, a sense of home? And that final line there, again, within each of the parts, this final line really highlights where she is in terms of this struggle. So she says, "And it claims me as its own." So almost the idea here in terms of her powerlessness in adapting to this struggle. We'll move on to part 3 of this poem, which is titled "A Place to Return to." And this part, I think, really does give us a sense of hope, and it's quite reflective in terms of where she is now in her life. And although perhaps she might feel some discomfort in terms of her connection and her sense of belonging to identity and culture, there is a sense of hope within this final part. So part 3, "A Place to Return to." So this section reflects the personas present where they are right now, in terms of referring to that title of part 3, "A Place to Return to." We have some dialogue within this stanza, within the first stanza, which does relate to her children. So her children are within this part 3, and they're talking to her about their sense of home, and that they have this real connection to this sense, to where they are, and perhaps she hasn't got that yet. The second stanza is a comparison of the persona. So we have the comparison of the father and what she has. So, and we know from looking at Lo's context that her father did grow up in relative poverty. So contrasting his upbringing with the life that she has now, and also the life that her children have. And then finally, the third stanza has both a biblical reference and also the idea. We also really have a strong connection here in terms of botanicals. So we've got some plants and some trees, which she symbolically and metaphorically refers to in terms of them finding a sense of home, and perhaps she's relating that to herself. So looking at the first stanza in part 3, so she's listing some things here. So she says bed, toilet, kitchen, exposed brick walls, the worn grey carpet, toys all over the floor, reminding me that I have left the life of the mind for this, home. The children call out in the car, we're going home. They must mean this place. There's a small amount of bitterness in this last line of this first stanza in terms of they must mean this place, this place. I think the diction of this is quite significant in this last line, in that perhaps she doesn't feel a sense of home within this, what she's described. And she's really described what home is for her in very physical attributes, so bed, toilet, kitchen, exposed brick, very accumulative physical items that she's referring to. And then we go on to the next line, worn grey carpet. And I think the colour association of grey there and the fact that it's worn, it's lived in, but yet it's still grey. And the connotations that we have with grey, perhaps it's not as warm as she would like it. It's not her own. It's not where she feels comfort, perhaps. We then have where she's returning, she's left that spiritual, that where she's in her head in part 1 and part 2, and we're shifted into reality in here where she says, I have left the life of the mind. So symbolically, she's back to reality for this. And again, that diction of the this and the repetition for the last line really highlights that disconnect perhaps with this place. And we have home. So we're going home. Her children are recalling that they're going home, and they seem quite excited about that. Home's capitalised. It's got the exclamation mark and it's got the dialogue figures here. So they're comfortable. They're excited to be going home, but perhaps she isn't. Looking at stanza 2, I consider my father born into a single room, the houses that housed his whole family, and this, running water, 6 sets of taps, a fridge, a washing machine, enough books for a dowager, empress, and a medieval king. So we've got the juxtaposition here between what her father had and what she has. And again, she's accumulating. She's just listing off these things as if they mean nothing. And in that last line, in terms of enough books, she's got that hyperbole there in terms of showing that, are these really relevant? Is this something that she needs? Showing, I guess, the contrast between the East and the West, and perhaps poverty versus prosperity. Do we need all of these things to have a sense of home, or is it that more metaphorical, symbolic meaning of what a home is? And finally, in stanza 3, it reads, if there must be a place, a tent for the body on this earth, I'll take this one, with the blue plumbago waving definitively through the natives, and the climbing white jasmine rampant over the fence, and the mulberry bush, that foreigner, so completely at home, growing taller each year. And this is that stanza that really does highlight that sense of hope. So we have that blue plumbago, which was the image I had on the first still of this particular part 3, which is a plant that was traditionally from South Africa, but has found its way, and in some ways, I guess, considered a weed within Australia, and has found its home. We see them everywhere. So we've got this botanical imagery that of these foreign plants that thrive here within Australia. And I guess she's hoping that that can be her. And she's accumulated that. So she's added to that the climbing white jasmine, again, a plant from Asia, which finds itself at home here within Australia. And finally, the mulberry tree. So this really strong, hearty tree, which can be found all over the world, yet considered a foreigner, is so completely at home. And metaphorically, I think that she really wants to identify herself with this tree, and we have that real sense of hope, again in that last line, growing taller each year. So perhaps this very strong plant, which is a metaphor for our persona, that over time she will continue to grow and have strength and find a sense of self within where she lives and her home, find her sense of home. So it's quite a reflective part in terms of where she is now in terms of her identity. And I think that these botanical images really identify and create a sense of hope for her in terms of identifying with her identity through her understanding of her culture and where she fits within the East and the West.